Hello, I'm Dr. Tim Culbert, one of the co-founders of Natural Mental Health. Thanks very much for joining us, and we welcome you all to today's presentation on bouncing back from disappointment and difficulty during the COVID-19 crisis. Well, you all know that it's been a rough few months for many of us during the COVID-19 crisis, and we have many months behind us, but also the truth is we also have many months still ahead filled with some stress and uncertainty, and that kids and the families that we work with will have some tough times to get through over the next few months as well. So the team at Natural Mental Health has created today's event in order to offer some helpful, effective strategies for both parents and healthcare practitioners alike to support the kids and teens that we love with resilience building skills, or what we call resilient childhood experiences. One big concern today is that stressful experiences during this coronavirus pandemic have resulted in kids, teens, and their parents feeling a profound sense of loss and disappointment about many things in their lives that have been taken away or restricted. For example, many of us have experienced the loss of preferred leisure activities. So for kids, that might be things like team sports, taking piano lessons, participating in a club after school, or just hanging out with friends in person when we want to. The loss of certain freedoms is another good example. For example, going to a live concert or eating out at a restaurant or even going shopping at times, these things have all been restricted to some extent. The loss of personal routines, things like actually going into the office versus working from home for adults. For kids, spending time at school in person versus online school. And certainly for many of us, spending less time being physically active and spending more time on electronic devices. And finally, a really big concern in terms of losses is that when we all feel depleted, disappointed, or just down, we can experience a loss of resilience, that ability we have to bounce back from challenging situations. So our goal this afternoon is with this event is to offer you all hope about the future and also to provide you with some ideas about safe, holistic strategies and skills to restore joy and resilience in your life and in the life of your children. And if you like what you hear during today's discussion, then please stick around until the end of the session, and I will share at that time with all of you details about in-depth workshops coming up on March 12th and also on April 16th, where you can learn even more about resilience building skills for the entire family. So now I'd like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, the other co-founder of Natural Mental Health, Dr. Henry Emmons. Henry?
Henry, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, and thank you, Tim, for the intro. So I'm just going to speak for a minute here because we want to hear from our guests. I just want to say a little bit about the context for this particular topic. So we're talking about some ways to help kids deal with depression. And I think it's apparent to a lot of us that kids and teens are really taking the brunt of the stress from this pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world right now. But I think it's worth pointing out that the mental health crisis, because that's what it is, didn't start just with the pandemic. It's really been going on for a while. And I think there's some really helpful and important data that's also pretty alarming that shows us that teens in particular have really been suffering for the last several years, maybe the last 5 to 10 years. So much so that rates of suicide, the numbers of kids showing up in emergency rooms because they feel like hurting themselves or feel suicidal, it's been increasing dramatically for the last 5 to 10 years, and it's only accelerated since COVID started. one way of looking at this, which I think is important, is that in addition to all of the stresses that we know about, I think that there also is an erosion of resilience among really all of us for all ages. But I think kids again are really struggling in that way. And by that I mean that they're the natural built-in mechanisms that we all rely upon to deal with the big stresses in our lives. They either are not there, they're not accessible to the kids and teens, or they haven't learned them, they don't have them in the first place. And so some of the things that we really like to focus on in natural mental health are things that people can do for themselves, that they can take with them and build and grow, so that they're not reliant just upon a medication or even just upon good psychotherapy, but they're building the kind of inner strength and resources that stick with them, and that can grow over a lifetime, because the stresses are never really going to go away. So we want to focus on some of that today. And we've got a couple of great guests that we're going to hear from to help bring that to life a bit more. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our new friend and host, Andrew Heaton, and he's going to introduce our guests.
Hello, very good to be back here. I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist, but I have been a teenager twice, and I am trying to become one again at some point. And so feel like I am very much involved in this particular conversation, and am very excited to hear from our two experts today, Dr. Anastasia Ristow and Omkar Sawardarkar. And why don't you two introduce yourselves? Tell us about yourselves and how you're involved with this.
Sure.
Omkar? Or no, Anastasia, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so hi, I'm Anastasia Ristow. I am just a quick little background. I am a clinical psychologist by trade. I've been doing this work for 17 plus years as a licensed psychologist. I primarily practice in an outpatient setting, typically within a group, such as with folks like Dr. Colbert at the Center for Integrative Mental Health at Prairie Care is where my current practice is. But I also am the director of psychotherapeutics there for Prairie Care. So I oversee a lot of our therapy type work and our therapists who are doing this kind of work throughout our system. So that's one little part of who I am, right? But there's a whole bunch of other puzzle pieces to who I am and who I bring to you today when we talk through some of the different pieces that we'll cover today. So I'm also a mother. I have 2 kids in elementary school. I'm a partner. I'm married. I have 2 foster dogs. I have about 20 fish, give or take, depending on the day and how things are going and who remembers to feed whom. I'm thankful that we humans aren't quite as finicky as fish are. And, you know, I come here as humble as I can, knowing that I also bring with me a particular cultural lens as a woman and with white skin. So all of the privileges that brings to the table as well. I'm really excited to join Omkar today to talk about some different topics relevant to our opening that Dr. Colbert and Dr. Emmons mentioned as well. So I'll pause and bounce it to you, Omkar.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Omkar. I use he, him pronouns. My interest is how do we unpack mental health in all its complexity through these lenses of integrating trauma awareness, identity, like the identities that we show up with. Dr. Ristow talked about race and gender. Are there other aspects of identity that are going to be relevant? And culture, right? So this is kind of a really interesting framework through which I approach this work. I've done, before getting into work with mental health, I've worked in a kind of a business and IT setting and nonprofit work. And I'm also a consultant right now. So my work is how do we do this individually or on a family system, but also organizationally and in any other system that affects mental health.
Great. Well, delighted to talk to you both again. We're coming up on a year of COVID, and this new normal that we're all living in. And we're hearing from people that are dealing with this that, you know, we're not okay, or our kids aren't okay. Is this something that you all are finding professionally?
Yeah, absolutely. And before kind of speaking a little bit specifically about the challenges of COVID, I want to kind of talk about crisis as a whole, right? And Henry spoke a little bit about this. There's a larger crisis around mental health. But if we start to really frame COVID in terms of a larger sense of how psychologically we navigate crisis, right? What are some things that are helpful? Crisis doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? Crisis can be an opportunity for healing. It can be an opportunity for transformation. I've done a lot of work in an inpatient setting with children who were suicidal, and navigating a range of different crises, right? That we might see grief or loss, some type of family conflict, trauma, abuse. So a range of challenges that humans experience. And often I think that children are more vulnerable in a lot of ways because they're sort of the lightning rods of our society. So it's a measure of how, in some ways, how a society is navigating challenges is paying attention to our children and how they're doing. And then we can see this uptick in suicidality and self-harm. And so in those situations, the challenge is not to only think about ways to stabilize, but how do we support kids in adapting and integrating the lessons and the grief. Often a big piece is how do we support kids in navigating and integrating the grief and making meaning and having support and navigating that crisis. And so I'll let Dr. Ristow speak a little bit more specifically to the implications of COVID, and This jump in again if there's things I want to add.
Thanks, Omkar. Yeah, and I think I too would frame this as COVID layered on top of and within all of the other complicated pieces that our kids and families and parents and adults who don't have kids, are moving through right now, that presents mental health challenge even beyond what we already were facing, as as Henry had noted earlier as well. I also hear a lot of parents say, what am I doing wrong? Or what am I not doing enough of to protect my kid? I'm worried about them. And I'm here to tell you the statistics tell us that you are not alone, and it is not as simple as you to blame, right? So you don't need to own all of the guilt and shame and worry that comes with what you are or aren't doing. We just are simply faced with a number of challenges right now. And I agree with you, Omkar, within that lies opportunity unlike never before. A recent study by the Child Mind Institute, actually towards the end of 2020, gave us a little bit of some nuggets to lean on in terms of just understanding how widespread this struggle is right now for kids and youth. That they did a survey of parents who were pursuing telehealth psychotherapy for their kids. And what they found in general is even beyond that, about 2/3 of the parents who responded to the survey reported a notable decline in their child's emotional well-being, in their child's behaviors, or in their physical and medical health throughout the course of 2020. And that's just 2020. So with all of the layers of the pandemic and civil tension and strain and unrest combined with just the multiple macro, big picture, as well as micro level cumulative traumas that are happening collectively. Within that data, it told us that about 40% of kids, according to reports by their parents, would meet criteria for clinical levels of anxiety. About 37% would meet criteria for depression. About 30% would meet criteria for problematic behaviors that were reaching a degree that it was getting in the way of daily functioning. So things like emotional or physical outbursts, defiance, noncompliance, refusal to do things like that. There's an additional 30% of kids with attention and focus issues such as ADD or ADHD, and about 27% were seeking help for difficulties related to their learning, their ability to absorb information in the context of all of what's going on. And particularly notable, I think, has already been noted by Henry and Tim and Omkar as well, is we really need to do better at paying attention to and tending the mental health needs of those kids, teenagers, and even young adults who perhaps have an identity variable that places them outside of the dominant culture. So those with gender identity that perhaps doesn't feel like a fit for them in comparison to others, culture, race, and even sexuality. These kids are the ones who are truly at high risk for these difficulties and don't have the access to the help that they need. So I'm excited about the possibilities that have been happening in terms of increasing that access through telehealth and things like that. But I certainly also recognize that we have some pretty big challenges facing us. One final piece I'll just add, that the data shows us, as well as certainly clinically, I'm seeing this all the time, things that prior to 2020 would have been considered really extreme and very concerning from a clinical, like as a clinician, my brain would have been like, ooh, you need to really pay attention to that, have become so common that we're almost expecting it. That doesn't mean that it's great. That doesn't mean that it's how we want it to be. That doesn't mean that it's healthy, but I can tell you that this is how a lot of kids are coping out of necessity. So things like overconsumption of social media, retreating really substantially into video gaming. And think about that with video gaming, especially the multiplayer. This is one of the few ways that teenagers and kids can connect with other teenagers and kids safely, because they're not able to do so physically being around each other. There's a lot more isolation, again, in part out of necessity. We're in a time where we're asking teenagers to be isolated with the very people whom they're supposed to be breaking away from so that they can figure out who they are. And they're stuck in this living situation with their immediate people who are living in the home. Self-harm, sleep pattern disruptions, these things are becoming very common. So these are the pieces we need to pay attention to as parents, as educators, as therapists, as psychologists, as doctors.
I haven't been a teenager for a long time, and I have a hard time remembering what it was like. I remember having a difficult time, but I don't remember why or how or what it felt like. And on top of that, it's my understanding that the human brain doesn't even finish developing till you're in your early 20s, which would mean that there might actually be hardware differences in how we as adults are coping with this versus how teenagers are coping with it. So can you all kind of walk us through what teenagers are going through and how they're experiencing this and coping with it?
Absolutely, and you're spot on. Difficulties with grief, with loss, with depression, all of this is potentially going to look very different for each one of us as adults, as well as for each one of us depending on our age and our developmental status. So we just need to know that these things do look differently from person to person, from household to household, from community to community, from culture to culture. We just need to know that. But some common threads that we typically see in terms of what does depression or grief or loss look like for kids that are really young. So 11 and under, like those elementary age type schools, elementary school types of ages, often we can see moods changing really rapidly. And this can freak parents out a little bit. And I'll tell you, I'm a psychologist, so I know these things rationally, but as a parent, I have many times with my kids where I'm like, whoa, what just happened? They can go from, and I'll move beyond just my kids, just in case they ever see this, that they don't have to be embarrassed. I'm not talking about you kids. But, kids this age can move from being super upset and like beyond consolable, crying, sobbing the whole bit, to 10 seconds later, loving, calm, collected, feeling, just wanting reassurance, needing love, things like that. So they can go from these pretty extreme states, and that's not unusual. We also see a lot of times they will play through or move through their emotions through their play, what they're doing with their different material goods around them. So we can see play becomes a bit more extreme, a bit more physical sometimes, depending on the kiddo. With their toys, they may mimic what they're feeling or what they're observing. Kids tend to work through their grief through their play. Often we will see things repeat. So they're working it through in a repetitive way, and they can be, again, playing in one way that's really extreme, and then the next be playing very differently, and that's just their way of moving through it. Sometimes we see regression with things like toileting, sleeping, sucking on thumbs, needing an adult present to fall asleep, things like that. Often more outbursts, more meltdowns. And the thing that's really important, I think, as parents and educators to understand about this age group, these young ones, is that they're not often really going to have the words to help us understand what they're thinking or feeling. Grief isn't going to be as obvious to them. So if we ask things like, why did you do that? Or what's wrong? They might not know. In fact, chances are they're not going to know. In terms of the tweens, we would call them, like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, and sometimes 14-year-olds, just depending on their maturity level. These kids do tend to also be confused by their feelings, and they're more likely to be just much more tearful, more likely to melt down, and sometimes more clingy. They're more likely to isolate themselves, and at times, especially towards people that they trust and they know are going to be there no matter what. They may be more irritable, more volatile, more reactive towards those folks as they're moving through their grief and through their different confusing feelings. These kids often need to tell what they're thinking and feeling, and then retell it, and then retell it. Similar to how younger kids will play it out, play it out, play it out. Kids in this middle age group will need to just talk about it endlessly. And what feels really big to them may not feel so big to an adult brain, but we just have to know in their world, their feelings and their thoughts can be very big and impactful. They might be overly focused on what they did or what they said or what they didn't do or what they didn't say in a particular situation. So they're more prone to kind of this higher sense of guilt or shame or blaming of themselves, even if that's far from the reality of how everybody else might see the situation. Their brains are kind of centered on their own experience and their own perception. So that's important for us to be aware of. Kids this age are often overwhelmed by the times that they feel sad or the times that they feel afraid, and they're not really quite sure what to do with that or what to do about it to make it feel better. So this means we see kind of everything pulls inside, and sometimes kids will start to have more sleep problems. In this case, it might be that they want to co-sleep more often than usual, or they have more nightmares. Sometimes you'll see more difficulties focusing and concentrating on things that normally are interesting to them. It's just not keeping their attention. And this is the age too where we very frequently start to see physical complaints that are a bit mysterious, that the medical doctors can't quite pin down what's behind it. Physical aches and pains, stomach aches are a big one, sensations with breathing or swallowing, things like that, headaches. Those can all really signal that they're working through something kind of big with their mental health, like grief, loss, or depression. So now for you, Heaton, let's talk about teenagers. For maybe if you're going to go through it a third time, you can just kind of know this.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah, when I finally get those pills, I'm ready.
Yeah, or some good therapy, might help you kind of move through that too. Sometimes it's about the skills, not the pills, right? So I don't know what's with the winking today. That's the second time I've winked, so I'm going to try.
But your rhyme game is on par.
Well, thank you. That's a common phrase that we tend to say around our natural mental health, right, folks? More skills, less pills. Yes. Okay. So teenagers, focus brain, right? Teens often will have just a general sense of like an initial response to something that's a grief or a loss is this sense of like denial, disbelief, like just almost like it looks like a refusal to acknowledge what's really happening. That's not necessarily what is actually happening internally, but that's what it can look like on the outside. They tend to feel very self-conscious and aware of their own emotions and how they're responding to their grief or traumatic, difficult situations. And they're very concerned about not looking different from others their age. They most often don't want to stand out. They really want to figure out how to fit in and be like everybody else. So showing emotion can be an incredibly vulnerable point for many teenagers. And of course, it depends on their culture and their particular variables, I guess, of growing up. But for many, it is a vulnerable feeling. So they tend to feel more shame and guilt over anything that maybe didn't go the way they expected it to go, or if they perceive that they played a particular role in a situation that didn't go well. And they often, especially in situations of loss where their expectations weren't met, they can become really preoccupied with revenge or retribution, how to like kind of make things right again. It's part of the brain development that's beautiful at this age and also really challenging. So we see teens tend to isolate more. I think it's often kind of a natural response to all the vulnerability with the feelings and the grief and trying to just find the space to figure it out. And some teenagers might, look to find ways to numb their pain, to numb their feelings, or to distract themselves. So that's where a lot of the overconsumption of social media or video gaming can come in as well. I hear a lot from parents at this stage of the game, and I'm hearing this a lot right now as we're moving through these hard times. Gosh, my teenager is so angry and so irritable. Like they're just so hard on me. My mama heart is breaking. Like I hear those kinds of things from parents, and they're exactly right. These kids, much like the youngers, can be pretty extreme with their emotions, but for teenagers particularly, we see a lot of irritability and reactivity, a lot of lashing out, especially towards those they feel safest around and those that they trust the most to be able to handle it. Now, they're not like consciously deciding, you get to have my anger, you get to have my anger, you don't. This is something that just kind of happens unconsciously. But if it helps any for those of you that are on the receiving end of that, to just know they're expressing this to you because they know you can handle it. They know you can be there for them, and they need you to figure out how to be there with them and stay with them through this, even when it is intense and when it is hard. I guess one final note about teens, and I would say this is true for those tweens as well, is that they're so technologically savvy. So they're doing their research. So we have to be aware they're hearing about things, they're looking things up, if they're having thoughts about hurting themselves in any kind of significant way, they're researching it. They're trying to find out more, which is really scary in the sense of like they have access to all kinds of information. If they don't hear from us alternative ways to deal with some of these feelings and to recognize it, they're going to go find that information somewhere else. So we need to be aware of that. Helping them to recognize those feelings is kind of the big place to start. That's a lot of information. Sorry.
I want to kind of add a few things, hopefully,
Yes,
that can support. You don't have to know everything to be a good support or parent, right? And there's all this kind of academic level of knowledge, which is really, really helpful to have that. And then on the other side, there's this kind of intuitive and empathic piece, right? And from that lens, I want to say a few things, right? One is there's a tendency often for parents to want to kind of protect their kids from really challenging dynamics or world realities, right? And it's almost like you can't do that, right? So then what's the alternative, right? It's how do you support them in walking alongside in navigating these complex life challenges, right? And ambiguity, right? So here's a few things that's really important in navigating this with children. Is one is being comfortable in that unknown. Being in the unknown with your kids can be a really powerful thing. Two is conflict, like being willing to healthy conflict, right? Not this kind of where there's back and forth and there isn't any movement, but this modeling and this ability to support in helping kids feeling heard, sort of like that collaborative problem solving model of like hearing them, also supporting them in hearing you, and finding that common ground and being creative. Um, Having some level of like improvisational skills of like learning to step in and step back and sort of attuning to the developmental need, not just from a logical sense, but from an embodied or emotional sense, like learning to um, kind of play in that space, being willing to take that risk, because kids are incredibly resilient, and you don't have to it's not like a math problem that there's one right answer. You got to kind of be in the relationship and play in that space. So those are kind of some of the skills and the kind of the emotional energies that are important to bring in working with kids in this developmental space.
Omkar, you've mentioned, and Dr. A, you've mentioned as well, grief and loss a couple of times, multiple times throughout our conversation today. Are they the same thing? Are they different? And either way, why are they important? If you could give us some just basic building blocks to understand those concepts and work with them, that would be great.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Something I like to say about grief is, grief is the space between, at least how I like to understand, is the space between what we have, what is, and what we wish for. And through that lens, it can be really powerful to start thinking about all of the grief that we're navigating, right? The you know everything from something really small, which may not be small to a child or a young person, is, I really wanted this type of meal and you made this, right? And there's like a little pain there and wound, all the way up through not being able to see your friends or losing someone or someone dying, a breakup, being rejected. And so when we start to think about that, we can really see that grief is such a core part of life. And so a big challenge is, how do we help and support young people in integrating rather than, compartmentalizing or avoiding grief. And so that's in the work that I've done in young people who are suicidal. Grief was an incredibly powerful theme as to a reason for, because I would work with these young people consistently seeing this theme of experiencing losing someone, but because that wasn't integrated, it was they got the message maybe of shame that I'm bad, I don't matter, that person isn't around anymore. And psychologically, logically, it may not make sense, but in the body, that's kind of what was the narrative that was held. And so then the challenge is to support kids in navigating that in a way that they can make their own sense of that, and even not make sense of it, but be okay with the unknown. And the final thing I'll say about grief is that our dominant culture doesn't really do a great job, right? It's all about, getting to the weekend and it's sunny, or if someone says that they're sad, the message is like, well, what's wrong? Rather than, oh yeah, I mean, that's kind of a normal thing to be sad, that's part of life. And sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad. And actually our emotions are much more complex. We might have kind of a mix of joy and sadness. And so we're not really cultivating that collectively and with each other. And so that's, children, I think, are picking up on that and can't make meaning of that dynamic often. And they're genuinely curious often, like, well, why should I be happy? Everything kind of sucks and the world is really hard, and you're just telling me to move on. It doesn't connect. And in that sense, there's kind of a really healthy relationship to connecting and questioning the world. And um, so how do we normalize grief is one of the pieces that I'm really interested in.
Dr. A?
Yeah, I mean, I just love that framework, Omkar. And I think you said it all so well. The only thing I would just bring it back to is that stands out for me is that grief is relative. You know, if you think about it as that space in between what you expected or what you hoped for and what the reality ended up being, that's such a good reminder for all of us to just recognize we can have the same exact situation, and for one person they experience grief and loss with that, and for the other person they don't, or their grief and loss is different, and that's okay. It's okay. So if your kid experiences a pretty big amount of grief because they didn't get the red gumball and instead they got the orange one, it might seem really silly to you as an adult, but there is a little bit of grief and loss there at a beginner level, and it's an important opportunity to name that and work through it with them, partner with them, honor that. Yeah.
Okay, so I understand that it's important that I talk to my kids, particularly teenagers, about grief and loss. I follow this. Here's the problem. I tend to step in it a lot. And if I mess up my friends, I can replace them. I can just get new friends, but I can't do that with my kids. So for anybody that's worried about talking to their kids about grief and loss, what advice do you have for them to not make it destructive, but rather positive?
Yeah.
First,
I mean,
oh, go ahead.
Omkar.
Yeah.
You go.
Well, two things. One is kids are incredibly resilient. I think this is in working with some of the most marginalized kids in our communities in an inpatient setting, and that were struggling with incredible amounts of trauma. I would see kids and support them in having these intense conflicts. Sometimes they might get physical with each other, and then have the ability to repair. And so it's such an incredibly beautiful thing that, and how do we even shift this paradigm to be like, are there things that we could be doing and learning from kids, right? Like how many adults do we know that can just hold on to a grudge like nobody else? And it's really striking, right? And yet I see children just navigate this fluidly. They express their emotions, they get it out, and they've moved on. And some of us are still holding on. So that's one, is just knowing that there's a sort of just a deep reservoir of resiliency. The second piece is I'm really interested in this shift, right? Can we shift collectively from a place of sort of this anxiety that we hold around causing harm to this cycle of rupture and repair, right? Which is actually, it's not the fact that we're going to cause harm. It's sort of, can we accept the fact that we're going to say something, not say something, forget something, do something that's going to cause harm. If we're really honest with ourselves, we know that we're going to cause each other some level of like rupture, some step on each other's toes, and it's just a given. But the repair piece is really where the magic happens. And so staying engaged and being curious and in a genuine way, in a consistent way, it's incredible. That's what healthy relationships are made of, not the fact that we're going to cause harm, but the fact that we stay present and model that repair piece.
I'm with you 100%, Omkar. In fact, I think we have to step in it, Andrew. We have to mess up in order to have the true full glory of what growth and development and connection means. So as a parent, if you're not messing up, then you're probably not paying attention. It's inherent in being a parent. It's inherent in being in a relationship, any relationship, and it's inherent in living life. And that's the beautiful thing about living life. So, I have parents sometimes who will say, I feel like I need to get my own stuff together first before I can start having these conversations with my kids about the loss and the grief. I don't want to lose it, because then they're going to be freaked out that I'm losing it. actually, if we wait until we have it all figured out before we have these conversations, then we're completely missing our opportunities. And our kids need to see us experiencing the feelings that we have and going through it, and seeing us coming full circle, that we can go through the feelings and come out probably stronger and better on the other end. So there's such value in sharing our grief and sharing our loss and sharing our other feelings with our kids and talking openly about this with them. Certainly if we're having big feels, then we need to do our own work too and lean into our own sources of support outside of our children. Our children are not there to be our support, but it's okay for us to feel what we feel with them and in their presence. The other just piece I would highlight is two things. One, just remembering the amazing value in just helping kids to become aware of and name what these feelings are, whether it's grief or loss or whatnot. And that starts with you by your own naming of that. So if you're noticing you're feeling something, instead of just thinking about it, actually putting it out there and mentioning it and opening that door for a little bit of conversation. And then B, it's okay to talk about hard things and scary things. Some parents worry that if I ask my kid, are you having thoughts about death, or are you having thoughts about hurting yourself, or are you having thoughts about how awful this time is because X, Y, or Z? If I ask these questions, it's going to plant the seeds and make them think about this, and I'm going to put them at more risk for becoming suicidal or having self-harm behaviors. And actually, the science tells us the opposite is true. We need to take the opportunities to have the conversations and follow their lead. It's okay to talk about these things. We're not going to cause them to become suicidal just because we're checking in to see if they're okay. Does that make sense?
Good to know. I feel much better now, and more empowered to engage in conversations. And it's helpful too, because the focus of the Resilient Kids Summit is about understanding how to help children and teenagers from the perspective of educators and therapists and all these different things. Do you have other points of advice on steps that parents can be taking to help their teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just trying to think what I could zoom in on additionally. Omkar, would there be anything you would add at this point?
Yeah, I think, we've named a few different things. I just made a list briefly, kind of the modeling piece. And again, this is a delicate dance, right? You don't want to just share. There's a dance of how do you share the most age appropriate, helpful piece with your kid without burdening them, right? So if it's about death or loss, like you don't want to be processing with them about the most challenging experience you've had with death or loss, but you can also share enough in a way that's vulnerable, but also centers their need, right? That's modeling. I think being comfortable in that, playing in that rupture repair, taking those risks, creating that container, modeling. I think even being comfortable with ambiguity, like as a therapist working with children and young people, it's important for me not to sound like a therapist, right? Oh, let's talk about your feelings. Is this grief and loss? Like it can sound a little clunky, and teenagers are going to pick up on that, right? So we have to be a little more attuned to be like, yeah, you're really bummed out, or you're feeling hurt or rejected, or you don't know what you feel like, and like following their lead a little bit, right? And it's like adapting to their worlds, and you know yeah, so those are some things, yeah.
And speaking of adapting, I was thinking about that too, that we're using a lot of, we're giving a lot of tips that have to do with words and talking. And one other thing to know is that that's not every kid's wheelhouse. That's not every kid's brain and how it works best in terms of dealing with their feelings and processing through that. So it's a great idea as an adult in the picture to get creative and think about other creative ways that kids can express how they're feeling, whether it's through art or music, physical activity, dance, play, connecting with others in a really creative way. That can feel really good for kids too, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the way we would think about dealing with grief with words or whatnot. A few other little nuggets that can be helpful, helping kids at some point to just notice things to be grateful for, to find their nuggets of appreciation and joy in their life, because they're there. Sometimes we just have to work a little harder to find them. And sometimes we have to zoom way in to what might seem like small things to find what that joy actually is amongst a whole bunch of unjoyful stuff surrounding us. The other piece with kids and teenagers too is, even if it's just one way to get back to a routine, something that's predictable and consistent, one routine at a time can make such a big difference. So even if it's one thing for a month that you focus on doing consistently with everybody in the household, or with you and that one particular child, that can be incredibly anchoring and grounding for them amidst all of the stress and strain and grief. And then perhaps even thinking about this time of our life as a time to create a new routine or a new ritual as a family or as a couple or as a household. Maybe after all of this kind of comes a little more clear in the next year or so, we'll be able to look back on this time and be like, oh my gosh, we would have never done that had we not been forced to slow down and stay inside the house for a while together, or look at the cool things that we started doing that we would have never done before had it not been for all of the hard things that we had to go through in 2020. So finding room for that joy and that laughter, finding room for some predictability, and know that, especially the way kids and teenagers' brains work, it is okay to facilitate joy and laughter, even in the midst of really thick, dark, deep grief. We have to have the joy and the laughter, and it's there. And Omkar, you pointed out, like, kids are amazingly resilient. That's probably my favorite thing about putting myself around kids and teens, is that they help me to find that joy, and I can help them to find that joy too. Yeah.
Wonderful. And because one of my few positive attributes is humor, this means that I might be of use as well. Or if not, I'll just play Airplane on loop again. I really like that film. Well, we've gone a bit over, so I'm going to go ahead and close it up here. But Anastasia and Omkar, it was absolutely delightful to talk to you again. Very helpful. Thank you. And I want to kick it back to Tim to sign us off.
Well, thanks, you guys. Great information. And if you want to hear more from Omkar and Anastasia and Dr. Henry Emmons and myself, if you'd like, you could definitely join us for a in-depth workshop that we've created that we're offering on March 12th. That's a Friday. As part of the Resilient Kids Summit, it's a virtual workshop on natural approaches to depression, 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. on that date. And please take a look at naturalmentalhealth.com if you'd like more information about attending that virtual workshop. Additionally, if you want even more information about resilience building skills for kids and families, also consider our virtual workshop on natural approaches for ADHD, which occurs on April 16th. Once again, that's a Friday from 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And if you also are dealing with an anxious teen or child, consider taking a look as well at our workshop on natural approaches for anxiety, which was recorded just back on February 5th, 2021, which is also available on our website at naturalmentalhealth.com. Once again, I want to thank Andrew Heaton, our host, Omkar Sawardekar, Anastasia Ristow, Henry Emmons, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Once again, if you want more information, please check out our website at naturalmentalhealth.com. Bye-bye.